because she's the creator of this whole thing. But I want two things from you. While we're here today, if you can put down your titles, if you can put down the PhD, if you can put down the executive director, the CEO, the this, the that, the title, for a day or two, so we can really get down to business. Because what really brought you here, what really allowed you to get to this space, what allowed me to get to this space is our service, is our commitment to our youth, the commitment to our communities, to our state, to equity. That's what really brought us here. So I want us to be sure that while we're looking and we're thinking about, if you're asking yourself the same question, why are you here? It's because you have the recognized ability to respond to a crisis. We are at one of the most important stages of our system. We have an opportunity to truly make change, impactful change. And it takes each and every one of you to do that. So we have an amazing program. We have an amazing group of panelists. We have an amazing keynote speaker for you today and tomorrow. You will take a lot from this, but I really want you to understand that we need you. So although we're here presenting information to you, it is extremely important for you to be engaged. It is extremely important for you to take part in this. We have hashtags. Please use the hashtags. They are hashtag racial equality, hashtag FICW 2019. And we will also have the ability for you to text questions, tweet questions. You will be able to engage with us the entire time. Please do that. Don't sweat like I'm going to sweat, right? Because you're not up in front of the place, but get to work today. We're going to work today, and we're going to work tomorrow. So with that, I want to introduce Dr. Price, Dr. Jessica Price. She is, I had the opportunity, she sent me her TED Talk. I said I wasn't going to mention it, but she sent me her TED Talk, and it was absolutely riveting. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but she had a TED Talk, and I've watched it 4 times today. So when she comes up and what she's put together here and her team, please take full advantage of it. I'm honored and I'm humbled to be here in the room amongst such leaders as yourselves. So without further ado, Dr. Jessica Price.
I got to pick this up because I'm tall. Good afternoon, everyone. Like Kevin said, I'm Jessica. I'm the Institute Director, and I am pleased to, again, welcome you to our 2nd annual Research Symposium. Today, we're going to focus on racial equity, and I want to start with a few acknowledgments. I'm going to call the Dean up when I'm finished, but I do want to publicly thank our Dean, Jim Clark, for his leadership and support of our work. Thank you. I also want to acknowledge our sponsors. You will hear from 2 of them today, but the other ones are in the program agenda, so take time to read about them. We appreciate your partnership on this sometimes challenging journey to racial equity. So thank our sponsors. I appreciate you. So this afternoon and tomorrow, it is my hope and goal that we don't just learn, but we are mobilized, energized, challenged, and also inspired, which is why I took a lot of time to think about who's going to step up here on this stage. And I'm so glad, I feel lucky that the Institute's date for the symposium somehow made it on the calendars of all these speakers, because they're very busy people, and they came from all over the country to visit us in Tallahassee. So I'm excited to hear from you all. Can we give all the speakers a hand? I'm very excited. So as Kevin said, this is invitation only, and I did it for a particular reason. So all of us do a lot of trainings and conferences. And I don't know about you all, but sometimes I leave a conference and I'm energized and excited, but it's short-lived. So I wanted to be thoughtful about who was in the room, because I wanted some assurance that you'd be fully engaged and that you would co-create this experience. And most of all, that you would consider it a call to action to take back what you gathered to your respective communities. So everyone has a folder. There are a few things I want to talk about in the folders. There's a set of evaluation sheets. Please complete those on the presentations and speakers today. Make sure we have those before you leave. There's also some pamphlets in the folder, hot off the press. We just finished the pamphlets. We partnered with Heartland for Children. They're research-based, legislation involved in these pamphlets. And if you know anyone that they'll be useful for, we have put them all on our website, and you can download the PDFs and pass those around. They're for people that engage with parenting and pregnant teenagers. So definitely wanted to acknowledge those. Hope that you'll find those useful. And the last thing I want to say is if you have any questions or concerns over this afternoon and tomorrow, please see the staff. If you are a staff at the Institute, would you mind standing? If you're in here, is anyone in here? Back here, Mariana. They might be all in the lobby. Let us know if we can help you. Bathrooms are right out here to the left. And again, thank you. I want to ask our dean to come up and welcome you as well.
Thank you. I'm so impressed with the program that Dr. Price and her team have put together. I'm so impressed to see so many leaders in the room today. And I want to emphasize in my welcome to you that doing a intensive symposium that's by invitation is a real compliment to you that you've been identified as a thought leader, as an action leader, as an advocate, as somebody who has very important insights to bring to the table. But not only that, is I think that this journey toward racial equity in child welfare in this state is going to be a decades-long journey. It's already begun, but I think it's a marvelous opportunity to get together and say, where are we on the journey? And where do we need to go in the future? And the fact that you're here really is inspiring to me that the future is going to be one of fellowship and not loneliness. Because that's one of the things that we really have to bring to the system is unity and social solidarity and clarity of purpose. And having myself in my career worked a lot in the child welfare system as in the courts and especially forensic mental health with children in the system, there's an incredible need for your wisdom, your commitment, and your fellowship. So we're very proud at FSU to be hosting the Florida Institute on Child Welfare. I'm very honored to work with a leader, a national leader like Dr. Price. And I just want to join in welcoming you, even though we're not on FSU campus. We just claim most of Tallahassee, right? Except for the FAMU area, right? But we're very pleased to have you and eager to get to work. So thanks for being here.
Quickly, we'll go ahead and I want to acknowledge and give our sponsors an opportunity to come up here and be able to present. So one of our sponsors, the Director of Quality Improvement and Training for Children's Home Society, Renee Ledford.
Just Renee for the next 2 days, right? Let me make sure I can move this. Well, I feel very honored to be here today. I consider myself a perpetual learner, and I feel like our organization is on that same journey to continue to learn and grow in this area. Children's Home Society of Florida has a very bold direction to end the need for foster care as we know it, by keeping families safe, strong, and together. We encourage children to, throughout their life, with core solutions in early childhood education, behavioral health, child welfare, and community solutions. One of those solutions, my personal favorite, is the community schools, community partnership schools. And at CHS, our solutions open doors to new opportunities for children and families and encourage them to build upon their strengths so they can realize their full potential. We're forever changing the foster care dynamic through innovative technology and strategic proven approaches. To realize this vision, we need to work for every family and each child, which means identifying and breaking down systemic barriers, including policies, practices, and norms, and attitudes that likely contribute to persistent racial disparities in child welfare. Before I go further, I kind of thought a lot about today and remembered a story that I read about a woman who was profiled in a local newspaper. So I just wanted to highlight some of the key aspects of her situation and imagining in the various ways that racial inequity intersects with child welfare practice in ways that really adversely affect client outcomes. Mrs. Smith, her 3 children were removed from her home 2 weeks after the local authorities responded to a domestic violence incident. Her children were there. There was no other signs of harm or previous reports of harm. Since then, they have been in the foster care system for almost a year. When the child welfare worker initially came to her home, Mrs. Smith was confused and defensive. She didn't understand why anyone would question her parenting and why she needed a plan. She sensed that her worker, who was young, white, and inexperienced, assumed that she was not a good parent and consequently did not trust her intentions. Despite being a loving and protective parent, she has had to complete parenting training, in addition to domestic violence classes, counseling, and attend numerous meetings and court hearings. Mrs. Smith lives in a community with few businesses and other resources. She also lives in a community with the highest rate of poverty. Since separating from her husband, she has found it very difficult as a result of those circumstances to find employment that allows her to have a flexible schedule to meet all of those requirements. Access to public transportation, as you can imagine, is limited, and there are few businesses and other resources in her area. She's had to walk several miles to get to a bus station, or spend countless hours begging, pleading, and with extended friends and family for transportation. Unfortunately, this has caused her to be late for a few appointments. Today in court, the worker described Mrs. Smith as unreliable and recommended extending the timeline for reunification. So we know Mrs. Smith's story is that this is not a single incident, right? Unfortunately, circumstances such as I described happen too often. There is no evidence in this story that anyone assessed the challenges that were faced by Mrs. Smith or took action to address the barriers that she was experiencing. Here's the reality for the children that we serve. We know that African American children are disproportionately represented in child welfare, and that communities have less access to culturally competent service providers. We know that poverty is really the biggest variable here, leading to necessary child welfare services, and that there's limited access to education, healthcare, and nutrition. Despite the need for services, as in Mrs. Smith's case, very frequently those services are not readily available. I reviewed a study in Texas of 3 Texas cities, just as an example. I'm hoping to get more information specific to Florida at this conference. And 25% of the Black and Hispanic neighborhoods did not have any child welfare services within 5 miles radius. They also had a very poor transportation system. And another study in Michigan, the clients in that system had limited access to court-appointed special advocates. And agencies, even though they were required to provide services in those neighborhoods, often were failing to do that. Further, there was a lack of quality assurance mechanisms to help identify and correct differential treatment and service. So there's a real lack of data and recognition of the disparate entry of African Americans into care. Specifically, studies tend to depend on more global indicators, such as national data, which does not give us a full picture at the local level. In addition to these child welfare system factors of lack of resources for families of color, insufficient data to track services, there is a national concern that equity standards are not being implemented in child welfare systems, partially due to implicit bias and discrimination by the individuals in the system. There's evidence that shows stereotypes related to race, ethnicity, socioeconomic, class, income, and behaviors can influence the decision-making process and lead to families' continued involvement, as in the case of Mrs. Smith. Despite the evidence, child protection workers routinely make decisions that are highly influenced by these personal bias, and those decisions largely go unquestioned by the child welfare agencies. Another study showed, this was out of the Society of Social Work and Research, revealed that the majority of frontline professional participants, even those with many years of experience, repeatedly chose to investigate scenarios that alleged drug abuse, even when they lacked information to suggest. This pattern suggests that personal values and child welfare workers, child welfare policies often conflict. In the desire to protect children, oftentimes supervisors and workers are ignoring established standards for initiating investigations and other points in the case. So we're here. Why is CHS so concerned about this? Well, that was probably a pretty good case there, right? So this data suggests that policies intended to protect families from unwarranted intrusion may be ignored or otherwise circumvented by frontline child welfare professionals when those values conflict. And though the mission is to protect children is encouraging, by failing to critically reflect on the influence of our own personal values and biases, and looking at how that affects decision-making along various points in the life of a case, we are being inconsistent. And for me, I'm a social worker, that would make me inconsistent with my tradition of social justice and protecting the vulnerable. At CHS, we believe that these biases and challenges are totally unacceptable. That's why greater diversity, equity, and inclusion is important to CHS. As a leader in child welfare, we are working to create the conditions that make greater equity possible so that all children have an opportunity to reach their full potential. With our goal to end foster care as we know it, we are in a unique position to support the necessary change using our strength in advocacy, our ability to build community partnerships, and our ability to create positive outcomes for children. Our leadership role as the voice of vulnerable children and their families gives us a unique platform to address the challenges and engage many different groups in this work. But we cannot do this work alone. Real change only happens when we come together around common values. Let me just tell you where we're starting at now. In early 2018, we formed a multidisciplinary statewide solutions group with a very long title, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Steering Committee. And the mission of this group is to promote an inclusive and affirming environment committed to delivering solutions that lead to strong, safe, and stable families, healthy children and families, and that also focuses on attracting and retaining a diverse, experienced workforce. We've also, in the last year, participated with the Alliance for Strong Children and Families and their Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion cohort. This cohort has focused on bringing together national social services and leaders to develop and advance diversity, equity, and inclusion as a driving force. Together, we know that greater diversity, equity, and inclusion will strengthen child welfare and increase the impact on our communities. At CHS, this aligns with our mission and creates stronger connections and networks to serve children and families throughout Florida. Collaboratively, and there's just a little screenshot there, we combined our efforts to develop a statewide plan focused on core solutions in racial disparity, including recruiting and retaining diverse and experienced team members, board members, and volunteers, defining DEI metrics, and I'm really looking forward to learning more about this today in the next 2 days, and methods for communication and collection of those metrics and accountability, and incorporating our continuous quality improvement to look at these diversity and how, critically look at where we are failing and what are those opportunities to improve. Seeking opportunities to build deeper relationships and partnerships with diverse community members, organizations, and leaders, communicating the importance of diversity and inclusion in child-related services to Florida's public, and informing our elected officials about DEI efforts and engage them in our role of making communities more inclusive and equitable. Social services really plays a pivotal role in encouraging communities to embrace diversity and inclusion. CHS is working to create opportunities to better understand and be with others unlike ourselves and experience what we all have in common. Diverse perspectives also improve the quality of our organizational strategy, bringing creativity and innovation to our problem solving, solution building, and future planning. We at CHS want to partner with groups and other stakeholders to heighten the opportunity for a collective approach to the important and necessary efforts of breaking systemic barriers to racial disparity. By working together, tapping into outside expertise, and holding each other accountable in an environment of mutual respect and shared responsibility, we can and we will make change happen. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Again, CHS, thank you for your investment on racial equity. Thank you again. We'll also go ahead and briefly hear from another sponsor, the Senior Director, Strategic Consulting from Casey Family Programming, Ms. Linda Morgan.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Kevin said, I'm Linda Jewel Morgan, MSW, University of Washington, 1981. And I am the Senior Director of Strategic Consulting. There's several of us around the country for Casey Family Programs. We work in all 50 states, 12 tribes, Puerto Rico, and the District of Columbia. And we have a relationship with child welfare organizations, other stakeholders, judges, many, many different folks in each of those states. And we're proud to be a sponsor of the Race Equity Symposium. So I'd like to just tell you a little more about Casey, who we are, who we're not, and also give you some examples in terms of our commitment to race equity. Jim Casey, we were founded by Jim Casey about 53 years ago. He's a gentleman who in 1907 started a bicycle messenger service in Seattle, which eventually became United Parcel Service, UPS. And in 1953 or so, he endowed Casey Family Programs. And our first, I would say, 3 or 4 decades, our focus was really on providing very high quality, long-term foster care for children. Back then, we really thought that was the very best thing we could do for kids who couldn't safely live at home. And then about maybe 14 or so years ago, we did a study of foster care alumni, ones who had, we called them Casey kids, the kids who had grown up in long-term foster care with Casey, and also kids in the public systems in Oregon and in Washington who had aged out of care. And I was not with Casey at the time. I've only been around about 11 years, but people were taken aback by the very poor outcomes these kids had in a number of areas, and that yes, the Casey kids did better, but they still did not do as well as Casey thought they would. So even though we put all, lots of resources, lots of funding, sending kids to college, all kinds of things, they didn't have a permanent family. And we really started changing our thinking at that time because we really understood the importance of keeping kids safely at home and of permanency for kids. So what we've been really focusing on the last 11 or 12 years is systems improvement. We still do some direct service. We have 9 field offices, mostly west of the Mississippi, but we do work, as I said earlier, in all 50 states, really trying to improve systems. And we're an operating foundation, which is kind of unusual. So that means in addition to giving some funding for different things, we also, to be operating, have to provide hands-on technical assistance and training. So that's why for each state, we have a senior director of strategic consulting, and most people have 2 or 3 states. Of course, Florida, you're so big and complex. I just have 1 state. And I live in Clearwater, and my background for many, many, many years, my whole career has been child welfare. The last 20 years has been consulting. So my colleagues are folks like me that work in different states. We can facilitate, we can train, we can, we really are content experts. And we're kind of the portal. In a minute, I'll talk about the other things Casey offers, but being the strategic consultant for Florida, I'm kind of the portal that people can go through to access many of our other opportunities and services. So our vision, and this has been for a long time, or actually our mission is to provide and improve and ultimately prevent the need for foster care. So we're still talking about foster care. What has really evolved over the last 5 or 6 years, though, our vision is to build communities of hope that best support the safety and success of every child and family, and to support a long-lasting transformation of the current child welfare system as we know it today into a true family and child well-being system that's community-based and involves many stakeholders around the country. So we're really into system transformation. Our tagline that you'll see on some of the rotating PowerPoint slides is safe children, strong families, and supportive communities. So I would say that that's kind of our outcome statement too, what we're working toward. We have 4 core values, and one of the 4 is diversity, equity, and anti-racism. A second one is relationships. As I mentioned, we work with many, many different stakeholders, other foundations, corporations, legislators, governors, first spouses. We also think it's very important that we work with constituents of child welfare. So we have a birth parent advisory committee we've had for several years. We do a lot of work with foster care alumni. Our other 2 are innovation and stewardship. Real quickly, the KC teams are, we have a public policy team. I'm already at 7 minutes. Oh my gosh. Thanks, Corey. We have a public policy team in DC. We're nonpartisan. Knowledge management team. They'll answer any question you have. Independent research services, national partnerships, and strategic consultant. So let me go very quickly, a couple minutes, just to give you some examples of our commitment to race equity. It really starts at the top with our executive leadership. So our CEO, Dr. William Bell, one of his primary initiatives is around boys and men of color. And it's a set of initiatives to improve outcomes for and to reduce violent-related deaths of Black males. And it includes Cities United initiative, which 145 mayors have signed on to, and My Brother's Keeper. Our executive vice president, Dr. David Sanders, a few years ago, President Obama asked him to chair the National Commission to Eliminate Child Abuse and Neglect. And very big report, and just a couple selected recommendations with that race equity lens, that the CFSRs, the Child and Family Services reviews that the feds do, incorporate an indicator of the degree to which racial disproportionality is found within various aspects of a state child welfare system. Another is to require race equity impact assessments when you're using or designing predictive analytics. The other thing is we love data. We have lots of standard reports at KC. And one standard report that, if you're interested, I can pull off my intranet for any county or any state is, excuse me, a racial disparity report. It's actually 2 pages long, got lots of different charts, but this one I think is the best because it really shows across the different child welfare decision points the proportion of children of different races and ethnicities that are affected by it. So if you look real quickly, this is Broward County, and white children are red, the red bars. Black or African American children are the blue, and then Latino and some other ethnicities. And just looking across for African American children, they're 36% of the child population in Broward County. They're 53% of the children who live in poverty in the county. Then we get into the child welfare system. They're 56% of the children who are screened in for investigation, 54% of kids entering care, 69% of children in care 2+ years. So mostly as you go deeper into the system, you really see that disproportionality grow. The good news is this is the chart. We use the federal data. We have agreements with all the states that we have access to the data they submit to the feds. And this chart is from federal fiscal year 2018, which ended September 30 last year. When we compared it to the year before, there were some really nice trends in Broward County. We saw a reduction in entries of African American children and an increase for African American children in permanency at 12 and 24 months. So I'm going to zip through here. Let's see. So we do many different projects around the country. We have just a couple. We have provide learning opportunities or support fund for Idaho child welfare workforce so that they better understand their role in addressing disparities for youth of color. We support the legislatively required Washington State Racial Disproportionality Advisory Council, which really promotes reduction of disproportionality. And lastly, I'll mention Broward County, because Corey has been working in Broward County for about 3 years, and Casey's been working with Broward County for longer than that. But I just want to highlight a couple of recent current projects. One is the Broward County Race Equity Work Group, and partner with the Urban League, Children's Services Council, many other stakeholders, and Corey can tell you more about it. And it really targets, they looked at 2 zip codes in the county where the home of predominantly African-American families living in poverty, and decided to target those 2 zip codes. And then the second Broward project is Broward Sheriff's Office Family Engagement Pilot Project. In Broward, the sheriff does the child protective investigation. We have a team with us here today from Broward that you'll hear from through the symposium. And that particular project also focuses on those 2 zip codes. Good news is we're there too, seeing some early progress in terms of reducing the number of African American kids coming into the system. So let me finish with 3 resources I wanted to mention to you. One is if you go to kc.org, we started several months ago a piece called Questions from the Field, and there are many different questions, some having to do, so for example, one is why should we bring a race equity lens to our work with children and families? And there's maybe a page or 2 response and discussion about that, but there's many things there, lots of research reports. The second is, of course, we have the Family First Act coming. There's a national website called familyfirstact.org that Casey and many other sponsors have supported the Foster Club, Foster Child Alumni, and it's excellent, lots of great information. The third is, you may have heard of it, new document documentary on HBO that premiered last night nationally. It's called Foster, 2 hours long, and it's about the foster care system in Los Angeles County, and lots of different opinions about it. I was very moved by it. It definitely shows the child welfare system as is. I thought pretty realistic, but also optimistic. So I'm going to segue now into introducing our keynote speaker for this afternoon, Corey Best. And when I asked Corey, what do you want me to say about you? He said, my 3 passions are family, social contribution, and justice. And Corey's son, Corvin, is 10 years old now. Corey is a wonderful dad. I met Corey in 2016 in Seattle when Casey was giving him a national award for excellence in child welfare, and was delighted to learn that he lived in Florida. So since that time, he's done a lot of work for us in many states, but also specifically in Florida. I've observed him in Orlando, for example, facilitating community cafes with parents in the highest poverty zip codes. A few months ago, I was with him when we visited with our public policy person, several legislators here in Tallahassee. He is amazing. He is an expert at engagement. He's great at listening, respecting, challenging, and he's really inspirational because he has a way of certainly engaging your head, because he's very smart and very articulate. He also engages your heart and your feelings. He's not afraid as a facilitator to wade in terms of feelings, and there's also sometimes tears in the room when Corey's facilitating, and also not afraid of having difficult conversations about race and other issues. So we're trying to keep as much time as possible for Corey in Florida, but the nation is getting aware of him, or has been. He's done a lot of keynotes at national conferences in the last few years. He's on boards of national organizations, and he provides technical assistance also to a number of national organizations. So let me introduce humble, genuine, inspirational Corey Best.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the invite. You know, a couple of funny things happened. I did not know that was the dean right there. So my son calls, and the phone just kept ringing and ringing and ringing. And I'm like, I look around, I'm like, dude, I cannot talk for 2 hours. Please don't call. So he says, do you think they'll listen? So, you know, hey, I say that because parenting can be messy sometimes, right? I mean, hey, that's just the reality of it. But more than anything, as we go into the weekend and I think about Mother's Day, right? I think about what my mom would say, like, you know, these people invited you into their home. You got to bring a gift, right? You got to bring something to the party. Well, I didn't know what everybody would like. So I definitely would like to bring my authenticity. And also in return for that, I'd ask for open-mindedness. And, you know, with the assumption that you're in this room for the same reason I'm in this room, that we would not fall into the traps of shame, blame, and guilt. That you would allow me to speak a truth, not only through my experiences as an African American. I call myself Black. I identify as Black, as a Black man in this world, not just from that truth, from that perspective, but I've also made several observations. And if I had my journals here, it may be about 3 reams of copy paper. So I've done a level of research, maybe not to the degree of a Brene Brown or what have you. However, I know that there are some variables behind the staggering data that Linda shared that we do not talk about. We don't understand it. It's perplexing. And, you know, since the 1964 Civil Rights Law, it is absolutely absurd for anybody, any one individual, to be overtly racist. So that keeps us in a perpetual cycle of not seeing what's right in front of us, and not also understanding that, to no fault of our own, we have been given a world that we did not ask for. Perfectly honest, I don't know, what ancestor, if any, was a slave. I don't know if you know, from a white perspective, if any of your peoples owned slave. However, we work, we live, we play in this world, yet and still we walk around, tiptoeing around, trying to be as polite as we possibly can, not making whiteness a real thing, understanding that risk factor is not just because of the color of your skin. I would like for us to challenge one another over the day and a half. There are things that I have learned, unlearned, and will relearn, hopefully, over the next day and a half. And I invite you as well to challenge me. That's the only way I grow. And one thing that my mom also said was, son, the only way around anything, truly, the only way around is straight through. And there are really very few shortcuts in this world. And I heard the dean mention a decade's worth of work. I challenge us to say, if we say 10 years, 9.5, let's cut that. This has been, I wouldn't necessarily say a fight. This has been a journey we've been on for centuries. This predates categorizing individuals based on racial identity. We have been fighting at times. We have seen lives lost. We have shared tears. We have facilitated meetings with the longest acronym ever to try to figure out what's going on with disparities. But what we know, if we have disparities, we have no parity. And I'm a firm believer that just the data alone, it's great to see, but we are caught in analysis paralysis, I do believe. That we continue to churn the cycle of racist ideologies, that politeness is the way to be, and that ultimately, from a Black perspective, sometime, you're talking to me? Oh, sometimes I internalize racism because I believe that superiority cannot coexist with inferiority. So what I'd like to do is just unpack some of that. And so for you guys who need CEOs, you might not explicitly see the objective, but know it's in there. It's in the story, all right? And I'll share a little bit of the story of myself and my colleagues in Broward that have allowed me to partner and learn what it means to see equity in the work. So I understand race equity as a process and an outcome, right? So it's not just the way we look through things. It's not just the group that we see. It's about taking that data that Linda shared, disaggregating it, looking at performance, and then being able to say, okay, how are the Black and brown kids doing compared to their white counterparts? Right now, they're not doing very well. We have made tons of progress, but unfortunately, depending upon who is explaining or conveying what that progress is often uneven and uncertain to many of us. So again, we sit in this room for people because of people who have walked a mile, who have cut trees down, who have paved roads for us to be able to have courageous, thoughtful, honest conversations about race, racisms, and race equity. So that's the perspective that I will come from today. You guys are probably in luck because I'm kind of boxed in a little bit. I can't, like, for those of you who know me, I'd be out there in the crowd and all of that because I want to feel the people, right? I want to feel what you feel because those things are not quantifiable. What's going on right now between me and Zach, I hope it's positive, but what's going on here, we can't measure that. And that's where we need to invest a lot of our energy on what's going on to help people feel like they belong. Just simply fitting in does not equate to belonging. So I grew up in Washington, D.C., and my earliest memory, I would say, of identifying as Black was I went to a junior high school. For those of you who are familiar with D.C., I went to a junior high school called Alice Deal. And Alice Deal was nestled in Tinleytown. So that's like uptown DC, right? So the backdrop, just to paint a picture, nice military school, and then maybe a half a mile through between the junior high school and the senior high school was a nice walkway. And you can see all of these amazing homes, yet and still, we played with a diverse group of children. Learned, played, fought, called names, discriminated against, all kinds of things that 7th and 8th grade kids do, right? But what was confusing to me as a 7th and 8th grade student growing up in civil protest rich Washington, D.C., was that I left the Tinleytown area to go east of the Capitol to a riot-ridden environment, right? That now today, those homes are like $4 million, right? So that's a whole nother story. This is not the conversation today. Stay with child welfare, I promise you. So what I learned early on was they considered my school like a melting pot. So we all sort of assimilated and found ourselves in a multicultural school. However, we weren't viewed for our uniqueness. So what I noticed then was that they were actually instilling in us that we should not see people's differences even when they're in our face. Like I wasn't allowed, or the message that I received in the 8th grade was that it wasn't okay for me to have celebrated my own differences because it was ultimately offensive. And that I need to focus on the similarities. Well, some of the glaring differences was that I took the metro 22 stops to get to Capitol Heights, and they walked home because I was bused to get special permission to go to a school that they thought was better. And then I realized that better meant whiter because the community was whiter. So therefore, I would get a better education because my school was in a whiter community. Those are the messages that I got at a very young age, that whiteness was better. So just to give you a little bit of the root. And I speed up a little bit because I'm often baffled by how to have those kinds of conversations with my own child. And that's that's something that I think parents go through. You want our kids to understand that you're unique in your own right. You definitely do not want to discriminate against anyone. And that my son's name is Corvin, and that, Corvin, it may be tough for you to hear this, but just know you don't have enough power, privilege, political clout to oppress anybody. But you can be a jerk, you can be prejudiced, you could be discriminatory, and those are the things that I don't want you to be. But the way the world is designed right now is that it's a group of individuals that have all that clout and can do things and make you feel certain ways that you should not feel. How do you tell a 10-year-old Black kid that? How do you tell a child that? And again, the trauma, the analysis paralysis, we have ultimately mistaken poverty for neglect, hence the higher numbers of kids coming into our system. So see, if I then am able to see a person's Blackness, that means that I have to attach the stereotype to that color. And I don't want to do that because I'm not racist. Because if I say I see your color, that means that when I say it's a moral issue, because everyone has equal access to things in our world today, so there's a reason why Black people are overpopulated in impoverished communities, that I then say, you are, or from my view, you are bad. So I have to attach something to that, and I don't want to do that because it's impolite to say what I truly feel or to say what the world has done to make me feel this way. Make sense? Yeah, you guys with me? Hey, you can scream in here. It's all right. Do it. So let me get through before I get too far on the tangent. But that is where my root came from. Again, a mom who worked the bulk of her life in a system that many Black and brown men fear, which was the law enforcement system, right? So today, I just really want to help us to open our eyes, open our minds, and begin to see race, racism, and race equity without blinders. There are a lot of bright spots in our world, in our work, in child welfare, families first. I really am digging the vision that Jerry Milner's laying down across the country, that we have to fundamentally challenge our core assumptions of even why we have a system like this. What if there was no child welfare system? What would we do with our kids and families? How have we just become overly dependent on paying for strangers to take care of people's kids when we can actually do something for families before that has to happen? And I think research is also showing us that the brightest of all is that everybody has somebody out there that loves them. Everybody has somebody out there that loves them, right? Everybody. And if we can find those people, our numbers would drastically decrease. I am not naive enough to say that we'll never have a need for foster care, but I think that those calls should be last, not first, right? Absolutely last. Dire need. I've exhausted all efforts. It's not diligent, as a dear friend Amelia would say. It's not diligent efforts. The search isn't over until you find somebody, right? That's when the search is over. Exhaustive efforts. I like that. I like the way that sounds. Sounds a little bold, right? A little gritty. Keep going. So, you know, today, and I'm going to follow along because I don't want to turn around on you guys. I'm going to follow along on my phone. The PowerPoint technology is amazing, right? We've made so many technological advances, and look where we are. We can't even talk about racism in a room. When I was in Broward, you know, confession here, when I was in Broward building relationships, so it was like a 17, 18-month process. The first 6 months of the race equity work group meetings. Can I say that again? The race equity work group meetings, first 6 months, nobody said the word racism. It was like, oh. The first time it came out, everybody got quiet. Right? He said racism. It's not about that. It's what's the risk in the community? Families need services. It can't be racism. No, not me. I love everybody, right? I love Black and brown families. So, we had a lot of fun. I mean, you know, we have to keep it light because it's challenging work. Finally, we were able to understand that what we wanted to do was look at the variables behind what drives the data. Like, what are certain things that's causing this disparity? And I have a few questions here that I throw on your laps throughout the day that have perplexed me. And the first is, you know, why are African American and Native Americans 3 times more likely to be in the child welfare system than non-Hispanic whites? 3 times more likely. That's one question that has baffled me, and some of what drives that other theory that we have to get behind just looking at the imbalance. Like, there are some things, some different sets of questions we need to begin to ask ourselves in order to find a deeper truth, right? The other is, what causes children of color to enter foster care system at a higher rate, even when they and their families have the same characteristics as comparable to white children and their families? The other question that I often ask myself is, what additional data do we need to acknowledge that our collective child welfare systems is another iteration of discriminatory, oppressive practices rooted in Eurocentric, individualistic values, meaning the whole bootstrap mentality? You can do it, I did it, right? The other one is for the leaders in the room, and I do believe that is everybody. So from my perspective, leadership goes beyond title or position. It's a set of behaviors that one possesses that can help transform, inspire, or spark new energy in someone. And they also give permission for people to fail forward, that mistakes are not necessarily rubbed in, they're rubbed out. Like, how do we get there? And how do you charge a workforce to do something different and give them permission to do something courageous? And what I mean is, how the system is currently designed, I'm frightened if my child ever has to see the CPI. I'm frightened if my child ever has to have a day of disrupted connection with me and placed in foster care. If I had to pick someone, some entity to raise my child, it would not be our current system. So that brings us full circle back to why it's like perplexing. If we are creating and designing a system that's good enough for our kids, then we would have lived some of the values that we speak. This brings me to the pitfalls of the intersection. So what I mean by that, I think it's clear that when it comes to using terms like cultural competence, inclusion, diversion, we have the opportunity that we miss the paved road. And what I mean is we often go into the intersections of sexism, the intersection of classism, the intersection of, ableism, all of those things that we choose to talk about. We have to understand first that there was a road paved to get us there. And we travel on that road daily. There was some animation on that slide too. It was kind of cool. Yeah. So we travel that road daily, right? But we don't talk about it. And as you can see from the illustration here, we continue to go round and round and round on that road, and it's right under us, and we refuse to address it. So think about it. Before there was an intersection, there had to be a road. Like, think about it from that perspective. What came first? The way our world was formed or the intersection? Now, I'm not discounting those things whatsoever. I'm only asking us to stay mindful of the space we're in today and to think about race, racism, and race equity, how we categorize people based on skin color. Can we do that? Yeah? Cool. So the other thing is, oh, there it is. That was on me. Well, you know how it is sometimes, right? So here's some things that may get us a little bit. I'm just going to warn you. A little bit that I'm going to be courageous here, and I'm not going to make apologies, but I don't want to offend anybody, but I'm not going to make apologies for how you react to that, because my intention is not to shame, blame, or guilt anybody. But we have to understand the road, the inheritance that we were given before we can move further. So for common ground, common language, I know my assumption is we all probably know this information, but a part of our design is rooted in these things we see behind us. And I'm sure that you can link one of these legacies to how we practice in-child welfare today. So the question that was asked to me was, Corey, what occurrences established globally wealth, power, and privilege to one at the demise of another? What occurrences happened? And so what we see here is slavery, capitalism, patriarchy, theft of native land, colonization, and universal Christianity, right? Those things permeate our values today. Take 2 seconds and just think about that for a moment. There are 15, 25-foot nutcrackers in Dubai, right? That's a Muslim country, right? Universal Christianity. nutcrackers at Christmas time taller than the Space Needle. I'm exaggerating. Colonization. We say that Black and brown families need services. We never say we need to love them more. They need services in order to get what? Better, to get to where we want them to be, our standards of what better is. And this is a generalization here for just a moment, but I want you to link the legacies that we've inherited to the way we see the world and how we show up with our Black and brown families. That's really all. So if we think about how we grapple with this information for just a moment, and then move into something a little more positive, is how we begin to talk about that. Like, how do we talk about race in an effective way that helps us all see things not necessarily different? I sit on a board of Aaliyah, and I have a smart colleague that, you know, Dwayne said to me a few months ago, you know, if you really want to know about oppression, do you ask the oppressed or do you ask the oppressor? And he's done this kind of work for a long time. And he says that it is getting quite frustrating for me as a Black man, because I don't feel I have to teach white people about racism. And he says, sometimes I think that they know it exists. They just choose not to see it, because if you're in an oppressed position as a group of people, well, can't you feel that you have your boot on my neck? Like, it's right there. How can you not see that? So Dwayne taught me a lot about facilitating productive conversations about race, because some of the things that often happen, and I think this is why we avoid the conversation, because it's some hot buttons right there. I mean, you know, it evokes a level of oftentimes uncontrollable reaction/responses, depending upon how you're showing up. So there's some racial realities that I'd like for us to consider as we go through the next day and a half as well. You know, that one, from a, typically research shows me that white and non-Black individuals often feel shame, blame, and guilted when the conversation of race comes up, for whatever reason. I didn't own slaves. I didn't do that. I'm Irish. Have you ever seen no Irish wanted signs? I don't have privilege. I was just as poor as you. All of these things, right? So we've heard this. We've heard these things. Do you know what women go through? All of that, right? We've heard that. I'm gay. Don't you know how hard it was for me to get this? And all of these things. And it keeps us fighting. So I firmly believe that we can't fight our way out of this one, that we need to throw the fight away, create something new that obsoletes the old, right? Because if we currently continue to fight without understanding our racial realities, someone has to lose. Historically, in a fight, someone has to lose. So having a conversation based on what we see right in front of us, I think everybody wins, because there's a new perspective gathered. So one thing that happens for Black individuals when we have this conversation is that they often feel that their experiences, our experiences, are invalidated, right? And whiteness is often dominant in those conversations, because quite honestly, it's a different experience when you have choice to see it or not. Like, quite honestly, this event itself is amazing. I am so grateful to be here. But the truth be told, there is truly no tangible benefit to white America to level the playing field. You don't have to be doing this work, so you should pat yourselves on the back and give yourselves a hand for sitting in this room today. Because honestly, no mandate, no policy, no federal law, no one says you have to do this. Because the system was designed for one, by one. And it was not designed for Black and brown people. So your work is challenging the status quo. What we're doing in this room is not the design of our current system. What we're doing in this room is quite radical at its core. But we have to be able to have the conversation about why we're doing it and for whom we're doing it. The other thing about race talk is there are hot buttons, right? Right? There's some hot buttons that we need to be mindful of, and I'll just extract a few things that comes along with these hot button conversations that I've learned across my time at facility. And I don't always do well at facilitating these conversations. Sometimes I get caught in the traps too. And I often usually just shut down, or I have to take a break and breathe because it is quite emotionally driven, right? But when we tell on racism, white or Black, that's the shocker. So go back to the 6 months. Like what we're seeing is racism. Like it is perpetuating racism, institutional, structural, telling on it, not being complicit about it. I was told a story from the world of domestic violence that if we had a loved one that was being abused by a partner and we cared about this person, we would say something. We would call the law. We would call the system. And if we had an opportunity, I'm assuming typically men would probably say one-on-one, man, you need to have a conversation because that's my sister you doing that to. We would do something. But when it comes to racism, we see it all the time and we don't say a damn thing. So are we complicit in the outcomes that we see in the community? Now, some people get a little bit embarrassed and there's this whole mantra of I'm innocent because I didn't do this to you specifically. It wasn't me. It wasn't my family. I come up, my mom was a hippie. She had everybody over. I loved everybody, right? I grew up in those environments, right? You should meet my mom. She's like the coolest person ever. My stepdad's Black, right? Okay, good. That's cool. How are you showing up in the world of challenging racism, right? What is your identity becomes the question. The other is when you think about rules, this one is always fun for me because here I am, prime example of how those rules show up right now. What did I say? I don't want to offend anybody by telling on racism. So please accept me. I am so grateful to be on the stage. I will try to tiptoe around the conversation. See, I did that intentionally, but it's the reality. So what we do is there's a master narrative and then there's a counter narrative. That counter narrative usually comes from the minority perspective. And I don't mean minority in numbers. I mean, it can be more whites than Blacks. I mean, more Blacks than whites in this room. And you still got the power, the privilege, and the color of skin to do something. And we feel that differently. So also the master narrative, typically through research, is telling me over and over again that whiteness isn't even seen as a race. Like we're not even seeing your whiteness in the room and like how that shows up. So the master narrative, true indeed, right? The master narrative tells us that we have a few protocol we need to follow because we're linear thinkers. We have to follow these protocol in order to have this kind of conversation and be mindful not to speak too much truth. But I don't think that there's a continuum of truth. I think it's truth or not. Same thing as I don't think it's a continuum of equity. It's equity or not, right? There's no little white truth, little white lie, right? It's the truth or it isn't. But there are three protocols that I want you guys to really, really think about here for just a moment as you're having conversation. See how you show up. Like, test yourself, challenge your own assumptions. But one is politeness. So at the core of this, Dr. Daryl Wing Su, he teaches at Columbia, does a lot of work in the field of how people behave when they have race conversations, like the behavior, the psychology of having race talk. I thought you were doing that because that was exciting, but it's just cold, right? So ego, like, I was like, I got one. Nope. She's like, I'm just cold. Just cold. So, that was my way of saying, can we hook you up a little bit? I got you. So politeness. And what I mean by that at the core is, again, goes back to what I touched on earlier. We don't necessarily want to attach to the ugly secrets of racism and how our world was formed. So it's easier for me to be polite about it and say certain things like, I don't see color. We're all the same. We come from the same place, but I don't know. I just got different things, right? But it's a politeness protocol that can often impede equity. I'm not encouraging anyone to be rude to people, but I'm encouraging us to be honest with ourselves in order to be honest with others. See, sometimes in the room, how we Black people show up in the politeness realm is when we see or feel racism and it's more than one or two of us in the meeting. You know what we do? Like, we do that. We don't call it out in the meeting. You know why? Because honestly, we know that people are going to sidestep it. We know that it's going to be devalued. And we know that we really don't have a fighting chance to make this a real thing in this freaking meeting because the master narrative has already set the parameters that we mustn't show up that way. And so when I'm unable to show up that way, think about a parent that's unable to show up authentically, and think about what that narrative is to them, their families, how it feels that you have not valued them for who they are. And they don't have much opportunity to drive any plans that you create for them because they too know how to freaking show up in the master narrative. So when you show up that way in the master narrative, ultimately what happens is you get bogarted. You get ran over. You don't get a chance to say your piece anymore. And what will often happen is, well, why didn't you say it in the meeting? I tried, right? So it happens. The academic protocol for the dean here, right? The academic protocol is something that I'll equate to those of us who have to have logic, linear. Like we have to have something, 1, 2, 3, quantifiable, it's real. I don't want to hear all of the hypothesis. I don't want to hear that empirically you believe or you saw or you observed, because remember, in those spaces, when you're up against the academic protocol, the message that's often received is that's only an isolated incident. Those are very small cases right there. I need something to show me on a scale in a logic model that this is quantifiable, that racism is real, and why. Because if I can't measure it, it ain't real. Think about it, how it shows up. The other one that I would like to unpack a little more is privilege evasion, sidestepping the differences, and also fear of being racism. But I'll land here before I go into my work with Broward. I'll land here on the colorblind protocol. This particular protocol is antithesis to anti-racist work. And I say that firmly, not from Corey Best's perspective, but from a psychological perspective, that there is no psychological founding and basis to support colorblind methodology as a way to advance equity. So I'll say this from a simpler, just a simple, drilled down, condensed perspective. When I started talking in the room today, how many of you identify me as Black? When I walked into the room today, before I started talking, how many of you identified me as Black? Let me ask you just a simple question, please, just by show of hands. Do you guys at least see physical differences in people of color? Like when you look at them, is that one of the first things you see? Yes or no? Yes or no? So it's not about rocket science. It's about valuing differences or devaluing differences. Is it about the color or about how we perceive the color? Which one is it? Because I'm going to tell you that I don't want a doctor working on my son with blinders on. I don't want the insurance salesman giving me advice without seeing everything around that. I don't want my investigators coming to my home without having all of the information to make a sound decision before jumping to unsafe. I want people to be able to see what is right in front of them, still make sound decisions based on facts. I want people to be uncomfortable with their biases and say, 4 weeks ago, I made a terrible decision, but I'm holding myself accountable and people around me are too. And that decision I made 4 weeks ago will not be made today. And I made it based on the skin color. I made it based on the messages that I get from the world. I made it based on society's view of color. I made it based on my own biases because I do see color and it does impact my decision making. That's a part of the conversation where I think we all should be if we know we've been on this road for such a very long time. Let's not bamboozle ourselves into thinking that we can will our way out of this and say, I don't see color strategically just because it sounds good, that under the skin, we're all the same. To the core, that is amazing. But I'd also like to say that a huge component of that particular ideology is deeply rooted in denial. We often ask families to have insight. What is insight? You know, at the core of that's a deep understanding of what's going on. like at the core of insight. It's like a fundamental knowledge that I truly get it. I understand it. Families take insight as an acknowledgement of guilt. Just by the way, just to let you know, just a little secret about insight. But honestly, it's about understanding, right? So think about how if we're collectively not valuing individuals by seeing their differences, celebrating those differences. Look at multiculturalism versus colorblind ideology. In the work of multiculturalism in the workplace, there's a study, I'll get to it. There's a study that says, you know, in the workplace, when we utilize colorblind methodology, staff feel more isolated, not celebrated, right? So I would encourage us to determine how we, one, not devalue individuals, understand that denial is definitely denying a person's differences. Denying a person's differences often denies the power and the privilege that we have. And when you deny that there's power and privilege, you're denying the personal benefits that systems ourselves get from being overtly, explicitly, or implicitly biased toward individuals of color. See, because if one benefits, then somebody else has to have less opportunity or doesn't benefit at all. So when I talk about colorblind methodology, I see that it is a perpetuation of well-intended individuals who truly find a belief system in there. And there's nothing to say that to the core, we would love to be able to see everybody as human beings. But honestly, we're not formed. That's not our formation. It's not how we were reared in America. We were reared to see people's otherness, and often that otherness as bad, as dehuman. Like, I mean, that is a part of real talk, right? The real race talk that we said we would have. So how do we not try to always solve a problem? How do we grow above the problem? Because we may not be able to solve that, but the more we can see one another, we'll see. And these are just a few facts that I have here, and I will outline them for you because I think it's critically important for us to know that there's a phenomenon and an aspiration to become race neutral, and some believe that it can produce procedural justice for many. I mentioned the workplace. Those who endorse colorblind ideology actually engage, the study says, in a higher rate of insensitive behaviors. You've read that? Yeah. The assumptions that colorblindness will make one seem less prejudiced, promote equality, and are all not supported by psychological literature. So I'm not just spewing an opinion here. You know, I made sure I put the site there because everything's Googleable these days, and I don't want to be caught up here saying I didn't have the data for you, right? This is real stuff. And just think about, if we don't see family, they don't feel valued. How then, if we want to see better outcomes in our community, how can we begin to honor the voices, the experiences of families? And another way to think about that is there's a little bit of risk that we all must take and tolerate, because it's becoming increasingly abundant that being Black is a risk factor. And Broward County has acknowledged that in their organization. How much time do I have, Jessica? Or just go? Oh, all right. See, the white guy said it. I'm like, yeah. Wait, shit. You know, see how it works? Quick. It's just that quick. Zach, it is really that fast, that instantly, automatically, right? Right? But I want to talk a little bit about my Broward team here. Everything that I shared with you were sort of themes that resonated out of conversations that we had in Broward. So the 17, 18 months with the Urban League, bringing stakeholders together to talk about racism, accountability. Where does it end? Where does it begin? What trainings are you offering your staff? So taking an equity approach, we thought, well, some of the pushback that I got was this is a little scary to think about doing it, not just from my Broward County Sheriff's Office, but from some around the race equity work group table, was we need a template, like a blueprint to do this work. And I'm thinking, well, I mean, if something was working, we might not be in this conversation right now. Like, we gotta stop doing the same things. Like, I'm sorry, but I'm just going to beg my supporters, can I take a leap and like experiment like with something that makes sense, but we're not able to measure? Can we just keep doing something that's obviously making a difference in the lives of one, your staff, and also your families? So on that note, we began to look at an equity approach that involved all kinds of stakeholders. So that's where we started. BSO was already on a path to figure out ways of reducing the number of kids coming into care. Wouldn't say they didn't know how, but it was just like, what do we do? And fearless leadership said, we want to put a stake in the ground and do something different. And we began to have conversations with parents, youth, staff, and executive leadership about racism, accountability, and what's done in your organization to train your people or coach your people on how they work with families. So I'll start with the parents first, because if that is where we're going to do the work, then that is where the community will grow. So when you think of engagement, we often think of services. I wanted to level up a little bit and think about equitable partnerships, authenticity. What needs to happen before a person gets into services? What are the behaviors that staff can do for and with you that'll help transform the way you see even systems? One of the questions. Another question that was asked of leaders was, what do you do to train your staff or coach your staff in deactivating biases? Same questions asked of their staff. This wasn't a covert, secretive thing. These individuals knew what staff was coming to the group to talk about what, and the staff knew too that their leaders were going to be there talking about similar things, and we were going to compare the data and look at that qualitative data and help that, utilize that to infuse our practices, right? Because we bank too much on the quantitative, so we figured we can use some mixed methods to kind of push some things along. Well, what came back as a result of that conversation from a leadership perspective was that we do cultural competence, diversity, the normal gamut, the first 90-day thing, right? Whatever that might be, we do that. And then after 90 days, it's over, right? So staff, same things. We're expected to meet people where they are, is what was said. So I asked the question, what does that look like in action? What does meeting people where they are look like? What are the characteristics of meeting people where they are? Parents and youth, they also said the same thing. A third of the youth said that we don't feel that it's racism. I grappled with that. I didn't really know what that meant, but when I really read the data, what came out was that they didn't care if it was black or white workers. The youth said, everybody treats us like we're nothing. Like it doesn't matter what color you are, they all have the same approach to us. So we took that information and we developed a flow. And I want to make sure that I give Broward just a few minutes to talk about it. So we looked at the why, the what, the how, the impact. And quickly, for you guys, I'm just going to say that BSO, Broward County Sheriff's Office, made a determination that they would not remain complicit in perpetuating racism, right? They just would not. Being Black would not be a danger threat. They began to organize. That's a new one, right, Yuritsa? Right? So organize and train and develop a squad to deepen their knowledge of racism. They experimented with the innovative approach. Linda touched on it earlier, family engagement and strengthening initiative, right? So we're moving from simply protecting kids to strengthening families. Huge difference there. Because if we go in just to protect kids, we're always going to find something wrong. And we know that we always want physical safety, but we're not looking at the psychological safety that kids and families need as well. Race equity training, flexible funding for families, laser emphasis focused on family engagement. And what I mean by that, I mean authentic family engagement, not service engagement. Totally different response when you're building healthier relationships with people. And we put some things in place that has a huge impact. I have a CPI worker right there. I have a supervisor. I have a deputy, and I have a director over there that can give me some data in the moment. We utilize, this is for the CEUs, guys. We utilize the protective factors approach to understand our parents differently and realize that the protective factors is not something that's for families. It starts in the organizations. The organizations then support families differently by mining for gold, we like to say, or looking for the blue. That's always looking for the positive. What's working right in the family? So it starts with building partnerships, ends with ensuring accountability. About the practice here, we extracted 9 values that came out of the conversations with our stakeholders and parents. And those 9 values are posted there, from altruism down to transparency. Now, this is meeting people where they are. This is what the family said they wanted. This is what the worker said that they could do to transform families or make them think differently. And also leadership believes that these values is something that will propel people to do things differently as well. And we'll be able to see families for who they are. So it's a values-based approach. Now, it's quite different because it's not about what the families can do. It's about our behavior. So there's an assessment that comes along with it. The assessment has indicators that you're achieving said value. The supervisor works with her squad to ensure that there's create a safer space where if I'm having challenges with working with Black and brown families, it's okay to say that in that space. You coach to the values. This, again, is what we consider meeting people where they are. So I have a question for Broward, maybe 3 questions total. Jessica, I did see you give me the 10 minutes, so we're going to go here. The impact. So Kim is the leader of Broward. Yuritsa is left in charge. What has been the immediate impact on staff? Like staff and then the data.
Hi, good afternoon. I think the impact on staff is that they feel empowered and they have a goal to change these 2 neighborhoods that they're working in, and they feel like they're going to do it. They understand that they're approaching families differently. I think the biggest change that I've seen really is it's a change in behavior of the child protective investigator. We still follow all the same policies, Chapter 39, that every other child protective investigator follows in the state of Florida. It's the change in their behavior and their approach with really engaging these families. That's the biggest difference. It hasn't been easy. We have faced challenges among our partners, with our partners in the system, because our behavior has changed. And they're like, whoa, wait a minute. It used to be when we came to legal staffings, we just told you, yeah, there's legal sufficiency, you should remove. And we used to say, okay. We don't do that anymore. We say, we think there might be legal sufficiency, but we're not removing. But we think maybe some case management is appropriate. Or we don't even go to legal because we can wrap them up with the appropriate services. They dig deep with these families. We've had cases that have had multiple cases in the past. And this sounds like a criticism of our own system, but this just shows the change that's occurring with these personnel. They are finding out things that happened to these parents years ago, traumas that they suffered when they were children or as young adults that nobody ever found out about. So nobody was ever able to provide them with the appropriate services to deal with the root cause. So the biggest issue and change that we've really seen, that I've seen, is the behavior of the staff, the ownership they feel of their families. These are their families, and they own their success. And that's not what we see with all the other investigators. The data, we actually set it up as sort of a pilot project where we had a control group so that we could compare. And you've got the first 4 months, very early data. It's a little early to draw any conclusions or trends, but you can see the data for January through April. Squad 5 is the pilot squad. We count removal episodes, and we count number of children. In the 2 zip codes that we're working in, there is a very, very high number of children per household. So if there is a removal, it's likely to be multiple children in one of those households. These are 2 neighborhoods like every other community has. There's poor housing, poor educational outcomes, high poverty, high criminal and juvenile justice rates, high rates of violence, both home violence, community neighborhood violence, and so we see multiple families living in each one of those homes, and that's why when you do end up with a removal, it's often multiple children. But you can already start to see a significant difference between that squad and the very low numbers of removals that they've had compared to the control group, which is business as usual, which are our other investigators who have not undergone the training and the coaching that the pilot squad has undergone. We were, I've worked at BSO previously, but I came back a couple of years ago, and when I got there, our removals were so high, we nearly bankrupt the community-based care agency. They literally were nearly bankrupt. We had very, very, very high rates of removal. And when we started talking about, what's our part in that and what can we do, it was like, we just got to jump in the deep end of the pool. We can't dance around this. I'm an old social worker. I've been around a long time. And I started my career as a child protective investigator. And there have been many models that have come and gone, policies that have come and gone, secretaries that have come and gone. I've worked in 3 different states. But guess what? The disproportionate number of children coming into foster care has remained constant. So I said, we got to do something different, and we're gonna break that up. We're gonna bust it up right here. So that's how we started.
Right on for busting it up. So let me get from a practice and supervisor perspective here. So even though all of those things are happening in a community, families are families, right? And some families are just messier than others. There's a level of risk that you must accept, because if you're going to think further upstream, prevention, ultimately keeping kids in the safety of their home and creating community conditions to do that, we know in the work of prevention that it's going to require some risk tolerance. Like, we're not going to be able to service our way out of everything, that there's a relationship component here. And I want to hear want to hear you talk about that. Like, how are you seeing in the moment CPIs valuing families differently? Either Tanil or Lisa, however you want to.
Well, my CPIs, I have an amazing team, I must say, first of all. They're really great at engaging families, as Kim said, getting the information that's really the core of the issues and trying to help them. What I tell them, and I can use all your fancy terms, but what I tell them honestly, most of them are parents. I haven't met a perfect parent yet. That could be you in that report any day. Most of us have not been spared because of the resources and the connections and the support that we have. Why a call has never been made on us as a parent. But it could be us any day. Our kids have had accidents. We probably spanked them before. We may have had a dispute with a loved one. Anything that brings you to the attention of the child welfare system. So I tell them, think about if that knock on the door was at your home. What would you want that investigator to know about you? What would you want them to see about your family? You may have had this incident, but does that define you? Does that make you what you are as a parent every day? I'm sure you have strengths as a parent that you would want that investigator to know about you as well. So I tell them to think about it like that. Think about if this was your child, your family. How would you want to see this handled? And it gives them a different perspective. And a lot of times they're like, yeah, you're right. Sometimes they tell me I'm wrong, but that's rare.
Thank you for that. So Tanil, congratulations. I know you just won a big award like CPI of Florida, all of that. Civilian of the Year, right? Yeah. That's how we do that. So question about colorblindness. All right. So you and I, we work together in a certain capacity on a monthly basis, and we challenge each other about race and bias and protective factors, all of these things. Going into January 13th, I believe the pilot went live 10th. So going into January 10th, do you see a difference in how you see Black and brown families? And if so, what are some of those things that may have changed your view?
Definitely, yes. I definitely saw a difference with my approach. I can only speak for my approach, but definitely meeting the families where they are, meaning engaging them, just pretty much sit down and having that conversation as to why they're involved with us, so, if they have a lot of priors with us, to get to the root of it. So a lot of the approach I use, of course, is the protective factors that, you embedded in their brains. But definitely breaking down barriers, just talking to them, to be honest with you, just really sitting down and having, sometimes I'm there for 2-3 hours to try to figure out what it is that is going on and providing services if there needs to be, but just being available to them. And that was not what was done prior to, this pilot project.
Ritz, I'm just going to wrap it up with you. So, we've done a lot of work. There's still a long way to go to achieve and see equity. I think it's great to be able to celebrate these wins. From your perspective, we talk a lot about we can't transmit anything we don't possess. So if Broward doesn't possess the skills and the values, then the families won't see that, right? And that's a fundamental belief that they have. So what are a few things that you've seen that have helped to support the squad?
Well, going back to the values-based assessment, I think that has been critical, because we're not just looking at tweaking what we do or, walking into a home and treating somebody with respect, because staff can go in and treat somebody well and the parent will never complain. But if they walk out and they still speak about families in a negative way, like this mom is crazy, or I can't believe what's happening there, then you're not really living those values and you're not really going to make a difference. So for us, holding ourselves accountable personally and as a team, when we hear someone, everyone has a bad day, or you see something that, kind of shakes you. But to say, he challenged us not to ever call our parents clients. So if we ever hear anyone say, oh, this client, you mean mom, or this parent, or this father, our families. And now they say, this is my family, like Kim was mentioning. And we're currently also working on developing, based on the same values, a parent survey. So we don't want to know that the investigator came and knocked on your door and explained your rights and responsibilities. I want to know that you felt that they treated you with respect, that you weren't treated less than, that you were valued as a parent, that when they left, they called you back like they said they were going to and kept you up to speed on what's going on, that they followed up with what they said they would, that they're living those values in practice, not just saying that they will do things or just treating you nicely.
Thank you. So those are my people right there, right? That's my tribe, as some would say. And we're gonna just take a few moments to open it up for questions, and I'll just charge you guys. You can read that on your own, but just some food for thought as you embark upon a race equity identity agenda, what have you, specifically child welfare or not. Have the conversations. Challenge yourselves. And if you are, speaking from a systems perspective here for just a moment, in everything you do, like in all that you do, every single thing, seek the wisdom of the families that you're serving. Like that is critically important because those families become the gateway to stronger communities. All right, and with that, I will take a couple of questions if you have it, because I need to go back to that one. We know better, so do better and be better, right? So are there any questions for myself or the Broward team? And thank you for your time today.
Listen, for this. I also to encourage you, being as though the sake of time, use your notepad to write down questions, and we will have a reception immediately after where you will be able to talk with Corey. We will begin in 5 minutes. If you are on the panel, please make your way to the stage. We will begin in 5 minutes. If you are on the panel, please make your way to the stage. I got your back. If you're on the panel, please go ahead and make your way to the panel. If you're sitting on the panel, please make your way to the stage. Okay, thank you. This is steps over this way. Yeah, come on this way. I was like, no, don't do it, but I'm ready. Whatever way you go. No, whatever way you want to sit. That's fine. I don't think she has name tags out here. Nope, you're free to go sit wherever. Here, let me tell you how I do it. We will begin in 1 minute. Please go ahead and make your way back to your seats. We will begin in 1 minute.